Good evening. Good evening. Good evening and welcome. This is the third event in the 2024-2025 Jepson Leadership Forum series, E Pluribus Unum, the divisions testing American democracy. I'm Sandra Peart. I'm Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, both in person and via live stream, for Dr. Eric Klinenberg's timely presentation, How 2020 Shaped 2024. At this year's forum, we invite scholars to discuss how division and polarization affect American democracy. We're exploring whether divisions and the struggle for common ground amongst us are making us stronger or tearing us apart. A group of McDowell student fellows met with Dr. Klinenberg earlier this afternoon to discuss this very question, a question that seems all the more relevant in the wake of the November 5th elections, which was the first American election in which I voted. I'm a Canadian, you see, but now I'm also American. I picked that one. As is our custom, we ask a leadership studies student to interview and then introduce our forum speaker at each event. Earlier today, Mariana Panariello conducted a Take 5 video interview of Dr. Klinenberg. We'll post that interview to the website in the coming weeks, so please check back. A sophomore from Long Island, New York, Mariana is double majoring in leadership studies and business administration with a concentration in marketing, a fabulous combination. She plays the piano. She loves attending New York Mets baseball games, and she volunteers at local animal shelters. Currently, she plans on pursuing an MBA and then working in New York City as a product marketing manager for an agency. Please join me in welcoming Mariana to the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Peart, for that lovely introduction. And now it is my turn to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Eric Klinenberg is the Helen Gould Shepard Professor of Social Science and the Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He is the author of 2020, One City, 7 People, and the Year Everything Changed. Published this year, his book chronicles the experiences of 7 ordinary New Yorkers in 2020 during the height of the pandemic. Dr. Klinenberg's other books include Palaces for People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone, Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, and a number of edited volumes. His books will be on sale during the reception immediately following his presentation tonight, so feel free to buy one or all of them. In addition to his books, Dr. Klinenberg's scholarly work has been published in journals including the American Sociological Review, Theory and Society, and Ethnography. Further, he has contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, and This American Life. Please join me in giving Dr. Klinenberg a warm welcome.
What a great introduction. I've never been introduced by a marketing student before. And listen, it's important for her to know that she's very good at her job. There we go, now you can hear me. Could you hear me before? It was hysterically funny. What I said was, not only is it great to be here, but it's the first time in my career that I've been introduced by a marketing student, which I recommend to all of you when you're trying to sell a book. And it's important for students here to know that they are effective and successful. And the only way that you can do that tonight for Mariana. Okay, I'm glad you're a quick crowd here. You're also a brave crowd, right? E pluribus unum. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Thad? The divisions testing American democracy. Are you ready for this?
No.
I said to my wife, I don't know what it was that made me think last spring I should come to Virginia, give a talk on the state of American democracy. Be ready for that. But I think I am. I've been looking forward to this, and it's going to be a little challenge. It's challenging for me. I'm a little nervous, and I think you know what? We should all be a little nervous right now. We should all be a little nervous, and we should be a little nervous no matter what team we're on in this game, because it actually doesn't matter that much if you're on Team Red or you're on Team Blue. We're about to start a whole new experiment. Things are going to be different. We should all be a little nervous. But you don't need to know that from me. You already are convinced that we should be a little nervous. I can tell some of the students are a little nervous because they're as far from me as they could possibly be. In the corner, when I was an undergrad, I had the same move. But I see you back there. I'm going to pick on you. You can't hide. And I know that all of you over here are not getting any extra credit for this, so I'm going to make sure that you're included in this too. And I'm going to take out my phone not to tweet, but to time myself. All right, so what I want to talk to you about tonight, what I want us to think about tonight is how this year 2020 shaped the current year that we're in and all the intense stuff that we've just experienced, 2024. That's the subject of the lecture tonight. And in the process, we're going to learn a lot about division in American society. But before I begin, because I don't want to insult your intelligence, just give me a show of hands. How many of you feel like you've already really processed everything you've experienced in 2020? You spent a lot of time thinking about 2020, and you feel like you've processed, you know what you went through and what it means for you. Just give me a quick, raise your hand as high as you can. Okay, one, two, okay, three. And they're in the back because they have an easy exit. Okay, so 3 of you, bless you and your therapist. 3 of you have processed what we lived through in 2020. So that's amazing. The argument I want to make tonight is that most of us haven't. And I guess I've already proven that. And as a consequence, a lot of the stuff that we live through, individually and collectively, is with us and has shaped our behavior. And in the same way that a traumatized child can't just get normal by forgetting about everything they experience as a child and just being a grown-up, I think so too, we can't collectively as a body politic just move on from 2020 without reckoning with what we did. So the argument I want to make tonight is that that's a part of what's going on. I'm going to try to explain how. And if you don't mind, I know it's not pleasant to do this, but I want to take you back to 2020 because I promise you, if there's anything I can promise you, it's at the end of the 45 minutes, we're going to feel like it's been worth our while. Like we got some. It was important to talk this out. Again, no matter what team you're on in this game. In the very early days of 2020, I was teaching a course at NYU. And there's this thing that psychologists call the paradox of cognition, which is that it's very difficult for us to take seriously threats that seem distant and remote because we're attuned to immediate things that we're dealing with right away. I was actually teaching a course on the sociology of climate change, and that's a big problem for people who are interested in climate change. It turns out most Americans do think climate change is real. Most Americans are concerned about climate change. They're just not nearly as concerned about climate change as they are about all the other stuff in front of them, like immigration, education, crime, health, inflation. Today, we want to deal with that. And the problem with climate change is this paradox. By the time we feel like it's the most important thing, it's going to be too late. So I was lecturing about that. And I said, as I was lecturing to my undergrads, for instance, in January, late January, how many of you are concerned about this new virus that they found in China? One student raised his hand. And he was Chinese. And he had just come from China to NYU. He got on like the last plane out. But over the course of the weeks, it got more and more urgent and more important until NYU was closed. Everything was closed. And I was living in New York City, which was the epicenter of this thing. And it was scary. Can I just ask, by the way, did any of you feel fear during 2020? Did anyone share that feeling of like it was scary to be 2020? More hands on this side of the room than that side of the room. But can I just ask on this side of the room, I want to see, anyone feel afraid for your parents, your grandparents, your community, what would happen in high school? Would you get to go to graduation or all that stuff? It was a scary time. And I remember being in New York and not knowing what to do and hearing that the World Health Organization had said the way we're going to survive this, what we want everyone to do is we're going to do this new thing. We called it social distancing. Remember social distancing? And I heard the World Health Organization say that, and it made some sense to me, social distancing, right? Because we had this new virus, and it was highly contagious, and we knew it could be lethal. We didn't know how lethal. We didn't know who was vulnerable, if it was kids, if it was older people. We didn't know a lot. It's always the case when there's a new virus and an emerging pandemic. We don't know a lot. There's huge amounts of uncertainty. I got what they were trying to say, don't go out and infect other people. But the first book I wrote was this book about a heat wave in Chicago, which you mentioned. Thank you very much. $15. Did I do that right, Mariana? Did I get that right? Okay. So I never studied marketing, but I'm going to get good at it. The story in heat wave that's a story of my home city. I grew up in Chicago. And it was a week when hundreds of people, 700 people in just a couple days died, mostly alone, isolated. And the problem that I knew right away when I heard social distancing is that if the message from public health is there's a crisis, what you need to do is go social distance, lock yourself at home, take care of yourself, forget about everybody else and come out when it's over, inevitably a lot of people are going to be vulnerable and a lot of people are going to get neglected. And that's a formula for a society that's going to break down, right? Social distance is everyone's on their own. And the way I got into this whole thing is I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times at the very beginning of this thing, and I wrote, we're using the wrong language. What's going to determine how well a society does right now, what's going to determine the fate of a nation, is their capacity to build this thing that sociologists have always been interested in, social solidarity. And the argument I made is the language, WHO has got it wrong, and it wasn't going to be the first time that the WHO got this wrong. What we needed to get through the pandemic was physical distance and social solidarity, right? Not social distance, it's the opposite of what we need, physical distance and social solidarity. And I then started to watch as societies around the world that were capable of building social solidarity, of looking out for one another, of having some common recognition of a collective project. I watched those countries do relatively well, and I watched the countries that had a very different notion, like profound social distance, not do so well. And at some point I thought, I'm going to write a book about this solidarity idea, and then I realized, actually, no, that's not really my superpower as a sociologist. What I should do is I should start to track what's happening in this event in real time. And originally I wanted to do it around the world, but you might remember COVID. It's hard to get on an airplane. Not a lot of countries wanted me. And so I thought, well, I can't go around the world, but I happen to live in New York. And in a weird way, the world had come to me. So that was a pretty good vantage point. And so I set out on this project to try to understand both how different societies fared and why they differed so much, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, at a very intimate scale, I wanted to understand the kind of lived experience, the personal experiences of people whose story in some way represented something larger, and with whom we could connect and relate. Because I'm a social scientist, and so the problem-solving part of my mind that likes to analyze numbers and statistics and compare things, it was definitely connecting to a certain part of the reality of 2020. Like, why did some societies have a dramatic drop in violent crime in 2020? but others, including the United States, see a spike in crime, right? Why did trust soar in some nations and drop precipitously in others? Those questions, they really satisfy like the analytic problem-solving part of my brain, but the part of my brain that turned to goo when I got scared about what was going to happen to me and my family and my parents and my kids, when I closed my eyes and I couldn't sleep at night, that personal fear thing that made it so difficult to access the experience, that I felt like I had put that in a black box somewhere and tucked it in the closet. And I'm guessing for a lot of you, the experience of 2020 is something that you put in a box and have tried very hard, thank you very much, not to go back to it. And I realized that the only way to get at that experiential side of what we lived through was to have really intimate conversations with real people. And so in this book, I found 7 people. One person from every borough of New York City, one person whose story represents something big about the story of the borough. And then I thought about 2 people, like 2 kinds of stories I'd missed by looking at the boroughs. And I missed the story of someone for whom the year was about the murder of George Floyd and the protest for Black Lives, the movement for Black Lives. And I also missed the story of someone who died very early in the pandemic. So I found a subway worker, a custodian, immigrant from India, and followed his story through his family. So I have 7 stories that I tell in this book. And the inspiration in some ways is an idea that I have pursued for most of my career, really since I wrote this book about the heat wave. And the idea is that crises are opportunities for us to learn, right? We can learn something from a disaster. We can learn something when things break down. And the idea is, if we look closely at what happens to a society in a crisis, we can learn who we are, we can learn what we value, we can learn whose lives matter. And so we better not miss the opportunity. There's another reason too, which is that some of the threats that we face are threats that aren't just going to go away, right? It's possible that at some point in our lifetime there'll be another infectious disease outbreak. There'll be another pandemic, right? We want to understand what works, what doesn't work, how we should think about it, all right? So I'm trying to do both those things. That's what I really want to talk to you about. So let me give you an example of this idea. Crises reveal things, okay? I want to take you back to March and April of 2020. Not in a hopefully disturbing way, just like try to get your mind there. And there was this moment where it became really clear that this threat was serious and we were going to have to adapt and change in a way that was uncomfortable and unusual. And we didn't know much about the disease still, but what we were told was, this thing is very scary and dangerous, and it's so potentially dangerous that we want you all to stop what you ordinarily do. Schools are closed. Remember that? Offices are closed. Restaurants, bars, gyms, music venues, beaches in some places, parks, basketball courts, it's all closed. Anybody here locked down in 2020? Go home? Remember that? We were all told to do that, except, it's my first example, there was a new category of people that we came up with in 2020. And we said, everybody should stay home because we're so worried about this virus, unless you belong to this new category of people. We have a special group of people. We never thought about them as a group before. And we came up with a name for them. And the name of this special new group of people was? Essential workers. Remember essential workers? Just another quick show of hands. How many of you have been talking a lot about essential workers these last few weeks? Just raise your hand. Okay, now we have not a hand. Not one. Why is that? Have they gone away? Are they no longer laboring, our essential workers? Can we go back and talk about what happened there for a second? Because I'm just stunned that we haven't stopped to talk about this thing we did. All right. Everybody stays home to protect yourself, protect your family, unless you're an essential worker. So, who are the essential workers? I live in New York City, right? The capital of capitalism. I know who the essential workers are. We all do. They're the finance guys, right? They're the guys who work in the white shoe law firm. The Knicks, right? Sorry, but the Yankees. But of course, we know, actually, that's what we said. That's what the market tells us. That's what the market tells us those are the essential workers, right? They get paid the essential dollars. But here's the thing sociologists like to talk about. In our lives together, we have all these open secrets. There's all these things we all know, but we never say, right? They're open secrets. Every society's got them. One of our open secrets, and I think you'll agree with me about this, is when push comes to shove and society has to function and the economy has to work, who are the essential workers? They're actually not the bankers, are they? They're not the finance guys. No offense to all the people who build buildings like this, right? What they are who are the essential workers? They're the custodians, right? They're the people who drive public transit. They're the people who work retail. They're the delivery drivers. They're the people who work in farms. They're the people who work in the meatpacking plants. We know that they're the healthcare workers, right? And not just the doctors and the nurses for whom we bang pots and pans in this beautiful expression of solidarity, but also the custodians and the kitchen workers, right? That we have this world of essential workers, for the most part outside of the doctors and nurses, not all that well paid, low-wage laborers. Now, we do this amazing thing in 2020. We say, actually, you are essential. You are the most important people we have. And the labor you do is the most important labor we have as a society. Now, when I heard that, I thought, this is amazing, right? This is like, I really want to talk to the students. This is like a revelatory moment because we kind of know it at some level, but we never say it out loud, and all the signals we get from the market tell us that's not the case. And in the world I live in, if you say the open secret out loud, that comes with a kind of moral obligation, right? Now that we all acknowledge that this is the reality, it seems like we now have established a kind of moral debt to the people whose life and labor make it possible for the rest of us to survive. Does that make sense? So one might imagine that a decent society, and I think we all imagine ourselves to be in a good society that tries to be decent. You could imagine that once you say the thing out loud, you establish an official category, government official category. Once we do that, there is now this commitment that we make, which is we will make sure that you have access to the best health care that money can buy, right? We will make sure that you have PPE, right? Masks, gloves, whatever you need, like the stuff they got in the hospital that keep the people in the hospital from getting sick. We want that for all these essential workers. Maybe a bonus, some money, right? Certainly recognition, acknowledgement. How about thank you, right? And now 2020 was a rough year. It was a rough year, but did anyone in the room have these moments in 2020 where you thought, hey, wait a minute. We might actually be on our way to a better society. There's some things that are getting revealed. We might come out of this a little better and stronger. We're saying things out loud. Like we can see these different models for organizing. Did anyone have moments like that? I had so many moments like that in 2020. You could see this thing coming ahead. And we really owed it to those folks. But in reality, as you all know, We didn't do any of that stuff for them, did we? Not one of those things, not even one of them. Because what we all learned about ourselves, what we learned about America in 2020, is that to be called essential was to be deemed expendable. To be called essential was in fact to be treated like your life did not matter. By the way, it wasn't just your life, because essential workers came home at the end of the workday. And you know who was home? Their spouses, their children, their parents. In many cases, other family members, their roommates. In New York City, where I live, the people who were essential workers were more likely to live in crowded residential units. And as soon as they got home, everybody in their unit was vulnerable too. So we weren't just asking them to put themselves at risk, we were asking them to put their families at risk. And you want to see the patterns of who got sick and who died? What do you think they're organized around? It was like, at that time, we walked ourselves to the edge of this moral precipice, right? Like you could see this thing. We're going to make this commitment. We're going to do this. And we got through it, got through that worst stage. And I said, nah, forget about it. I mean, we didn't really say that part out loud. We didn't say forget about it, but that is what we've done. That's what we've done, right? We've forgotten about it. It just didn't happen. But you know what? I don't think we really forgot somewhere deep down. I don't think we really forgot. I paid a lot of attention. Did you guys find out about this election we had a few weeks ago here? Did you follow that? So I got kind of into it. I wanted to see, what are people talking about? And what's driving the way that people vote and behave? And there's inflation's terrible, and there's all kinds of stuff that people don't like about, what's going on right now. It's a tough time to be in charge. But a lot of Americans feel betrayed. They feel a sense that the institutions, society, the leaders that promised to take care of them, gestured towards a moral commitment to do something and didn't deliver. Feel like they're on their own. And they're frustrated about it. And angry. And there's a weird thing that happened, in my view, which is because we have this will not to know about 2020, because we don't want to talk about it because it's unpleasant, because we all put our fears in the black boxes, we're all so eager to get beyond it, right? The second we could get beyond it, we did. I was at a panel with a medical doctor last week at the American Public Health Association conference. He said, what happened in America, he said, his words were like, the Republicans want to say the pandemic never happened, and the Democrats insist that it ended way before it did. So Team Red and Team Blue, one thing we agree on is we're not going back there. But because we don't want to talk about it, the guy who was president in 2020 got a free pass. Nobody thinks he was accountable for that, what happened in that year, but the team that was in charge afterwards did not, because we're upset that we haven't gotten over it. We're upset that we're still in that, we still have that feeling. We're trapped in that moment. And I think that sentiment, that betrayal, that feeling of anger is really with us right now, fueling this. But it's not just that sense of anger and betrayal. There's something else going on, which is a profound division and a sense of distrust and a kind of agitation and anger about the current situation. And anybody here alive before 2020? Just, yeah, paying attention? Okay, so you'll all remember all the stuff, those things I just described, those were not new in 2020, right? It's anger, distrust, division, polarization, that was not like born in 2020, right? We all lived through the years before that. But they got whipped up, intensified in this country in an incredibly extreme way. And I've compared what happened in the US to what happened in countries around the world. And oftentimes what we do when we analyze who's successful in 2020, who dealt with the pandemic well, is we look at morbidity, mortality. But there's another metric, which is how divided, how distrustful did we become? And the US is off the charts. I want to remind you one reason why. And the way I want to do this, I'm going to tell you about another part of the book. I got really curious about this thing. Maybe this occurred to you too. Remember face masks? Remember those masks? Why is it that in some parts of the world, when people were advised to wear masks, they just did? Why is it that in other parts of the world, when people were advised to wear masks, some people did, some people didn't, and they just kind of left it at that? But in this country, everybody on this side of the room got a mask on, and everybody on this side of the room said, I'm not wearing a mask. And then they all met up in the aisle and beat the crap out of each other. You remember that? I've got a collection of what I call face mask, face off videos. And it's an American phenomenon. It went around the world. We exported it eventually, but in 2020, we were beating the crap out of each other in Costco, Trader Joe's, Walmart. There were homicides. There were homicides, ladies and gentlemen. We were shooting each other. Do you remember this? Have you thought of what was going on there? All right, I went way deep on that question. How did that happen? Do you feel like you know how that happened? Here's my story of how that happened. I've told you before the WHO made a lot of mistakes. Well, one of them was that the messaging on masks was really weird and hard for people to follow. There are a lot of societies on Earth that are accustomed to wearing masks when there's an infectious disease outbreak, even when there's just an ordinary flu going around or cold. I was struck with the first times I went to Japan. I saw lots of people wearing masks, and I thought, they don't want to get sick. And someone said, no, it's that they're not feeling well and they don't want other people to get sick. I thought, that's a solidarity. Talk about, that's the thing. So there are a lot of societies where people are accustomed to wearing masks. And there's some places that learned from the SARS virus outbreak in 2003, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Singapore, you better have a lot of masks on hand because they do work pretty well for preventing some coronaviruses from spreading. And a lot of societies said immediately, we're just going to get masks. So they started producing a lot of masks, distributing masks, before there was real evidence on how effective specifically masks would be for this new coronavirus. But the WHO, for reasons that are hotly debated in epidemiology world, said we're not going to do a mask guideline. We're not going to require masks or recommend masks until we have specific evidence that this virus can be slowed. The transmission can be slowed by masks. And so it wasn't until, and they needed new empirical evidence to demonstrate that. And of course, the new virus, it takes a while. But by late March, early April, there was enough published science that they felt, rightly or wrongly, like it was time to recommend masks. So the WHO changed its mandate, not its mandate, its recommendations. The US Center for Disease Control and Prevention changed its story, right? Remember before that, like Fauci, for instance, said, you don't need to wear a mask. And there was a lot of concern about whether there was enough in the global supply. There was concern that people working in hospitals wouldn't have masks, essential workers wouldn't have masks. Fauci was saying, no, don't wear them. And then early April, the CDC changes its recommendation. So I wanted to see how that happened. So I went back and I looked at the transcripts of the political events of the moment. And there's an amazing thing, which is President Trump on April 3rd, 2020 gets up and he makes this announcement. The CDC today has changed its guideline and it's now recommending that people wear masks if they're in public. Sounds very reasonable, right? Then he says this amazing thing. He says, personally, I'm not going to do it. All right, now, I don't actually believe that presidents have massive capacity to shape public opinion. Like if Joe Biden goes to Florida today and tells everybody the sky is blue, 60% of Florida is going to think the sky is red, right? Presidents do not get to dictate public opinion. But when you're in an uncertain situation and people are scrambling for information and it feels like life is at stake, that's when you as a president, you from the White House, the federal government have an unusual amount of influence. And it was influential for the president to say the CDC has made this recommendation, even more influential for the president to say, personally, I'm not gonna do it. What are we to do as Americans if we're looking for advice? How do we deal with that information? Well, over here we got Team Red, right? And Team Red, we learn very quickly, especially those of you on Team Red who are sitting in the first rows, you're close to the president, you're in the inner circle, you're with the cabinet. It becomes clear that for the president, wearing a mask, it's not just like wrong scientifically, it's morally suspect. If you wear a mask, you look like you're afraid, right? You're a coward, you're fearful, you're feminine, bad things. The way you show fealty is you bare your face. And so suddenly, members of the circle are all baring their faces in public. And there's a signal moment for this, that those of you who followed the event, maybe you didn't follow it, this might ring a bell for you. Mike Pence, does anyone remember Mike Pence here, by the way? You remember Mike Pence? All right, Mike Pence was the Vice President of the United States, also was the head of the White House's task force on COVID, right? Some countries had doctors, public health people. We had Mike Pence. And Mike Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic. You know about the Mayo Clinic? All right, let me tell you guys. Over here, the Mayo Clinic, the Mayo Clinic is, you go to the Mayo Clinic if you're all the hospitals, all the doctors where you live can't figure out what's really going wrong with you. You've got a really serious medical problem, and the doctors, even if you are like at the best hospital in New York or, you know, Charlottesville or Richmond, wherever it is, the doctors can't figure it out, and you go to the Mayo Clinic because you're really, really sick and it's complex. Make sense? So Mike Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic, and he's with the doctors and the nurses and the patients. It's the peak pandemic, first wave, and he's the only guy in the zip code who's not wearing a mask. And it becomes a signal to everybody on this team over here, you should not wear a mask. And you don't. There's some exceptions, older people maybe have a little bit more, they're not sure they want to make that bet, but rates of mask wearing become way lower on Team Red. But this isn't just like, don't get too cocky over here, Team Blue. Here's what happens with Team Blue. Team Blue sees that Team Red is baring their face. It's like giving you the finger, right? And so Team Blue, what we figure out in Team Blue over here on this side is, wait a minute, like a mask, that's, when you wear a mask, you're showing solidarity with each other. You're showing mutual respect, right? We're showing we're in it together. We're expressing our belief in science. So all the political candidates on Team Blue change their political ads, and even though they're just in front of cameras, they're all wearing masks. Remember that? Suddenly everybody on Team Blue is wearing a mask. And I go on Twitter and I change my Twitter name to Eric #Where'sAMask Klinenberg, right? No, I'm not kidding. Some of your old friends who don't update stuff, they still have that up there. I guarantee you, some of you old people here, you have friends who are on Facebook for some reason and they still have the mask picture, right? Because that happens, right? You're laughing because you know it's true. And so then like you're walking in the grocery store. I bet somebody here's had this experience. You're walking in the grocery store, you're already nodding. You're in Richmond, it's April. You're in the grocery store going shopping, and you see like a person with a mask on, right? And you're like, yes, you're on my team. You're on my team, right? Yes, got a mask on, you're on my team. And then, why aren't you wearing a mask? What's wrong with you? You're not wearing a mask? Don't you know I live with my grandmother? Do you remember that feeling? Did anyone have this feeling? You're walking in the store or you're on the street and you're 10 feet away from someone. We don't know anything. It's April. And we're so angry about, why aren't you wearing a mask? Feel it like an assault. Did anyone have that experience? Is it just me? You're making me feel a little crazy here. Did anyone else have that? Right? Yeah, what's the point, man? So our blood was boiling over here, and why does this? And then the next thing happens, we bump into each other in the aisle, and of course we're going to throw, right? Because we're amped up, and you know what else? The mask has nothing to do with health at this point for us in America. It had nothing to do with health at this point. It did have something to do with health, but that wasn't how we experienced it and lived it. We had invested in this little piece of fabric all of the weight of our political ideology. So when you wore a mask, you were really, yes, it was a health choice, but it was like you were wearing a Mets cap or you were wearing a Yankees cap, wasn't it? And at first it was mask, but then you know what happened? And this has never happened in my lifetime. Over here on Team Blue, someone gets COVID. Go to the doctor, and the doctor's like, oh, you should get this medicine, remdesivir. Like, oh, doctor, thank you very much. Remdesivir sounds like a great medication. I'm going to go get a prescription now. But then someone over here on Team Red gets COVID. And they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you might hear about people over there getting remdesivir. There's a drug called ivermectin. It's a much better drug. It's the drug for you. Like, yes, get me that ivermectin. And then we're screaming, ivermectin, remdesivir. Remember that? Now we got different medicines based on which state we live in. And then this incredible thing happens. Like arguably the best thing that America does in 2020, the great success, maybe the great success, maybe the only great success of the first Trump presidency is this thing called Operation Warp Speed. Remember that? Clear the regulatory burdens, get these vaccines out to market, right, fast. And wow, what an amazing thing to have these vaccines that could come in and save lives, right? Remember that? Remember some of us were on our knees crying, praying to God. I remember the moment I got my vaccine, it was like the skies lifted, right? It was like, some of you might remember this. Just before the election, about a month before the election, Trump went to the FDA and said, I want you to approve this vaccine right now. I want it approved because I want every American getting vaccinated when the election happens. I want the boost and confidence and the appreciation for that. And the FDA says like, no, we're not ready. We got to do our tests. And Trump gets really pissed off. And the FDA doesn't approve the vaccines until after the election, which I hope this is not too controversial to say here, he lost. And now look, this Operation Warp Speed thing was a major policy success, right? And there's a world in which, instead of calling them Pfizer and Moderna, we call the vaccines Ivana and Ivanka. And after you get one, you get like a Trump Band-Aid on your arm. This is no joke, by the way. And look, had the FDA approved it, what would have happened is that every person in a red state would have taken the thing, and every person in the blue state would have been like, I don't know, they rushed it to market, I don't feel like it's safe. But instead, when it came out, when it got approved, the last president, the president-to-be, he didn't want Biden to get credit for it. So he didn't want to advocate for it in public, and the rates of vaccination in red states were way low, and the rates in the vaccine acceptance in the blue states were much higher. And after 2020, the mortality flipped, so that people in red states become much more vulnerable because they wouldn't take the vaccine. And now, who knows what's going to happen with vaccines in this country? It's not just the COVID vaccine. Measles, mumps, rubella. This is a scary situation. Scary situation. Now again, I'm not saying polarization was new in 2020. But in 2024, we are out there in such an extreme way. We're so divided, we're so distrustful, we're so ideological on this stuff. I fear where we're going next. We should all be nervous right now. If you're not feeling nervous, you're not paying attention. No matter what team you're on, we're going for a ride. Let me tell you one last thing. I haven't really talked about my 7 people. And I promise the 7 people are the key to the whole thing. Because collectively at some national level, we are bonkers. But actually, when you get down into your little world, your community, you see some amazing stuff happen. And I wasn't really sure which of the 7 people I wrote about I wanted to tell you about tonight, but I've decided, now that we've landed here, I'm going to tell you about a woman named Nuala O'Doherty, who's from Queens. We're going to end by talking about Nuala O'Doherty. And like I told you, every character in the book stands for something in their borough. So I was planning on talking to you about a guy named Danny Presti from Staten Island, who's a bar manager, whose story about 2020 is he got radicalized on the right. His bar got shut down, he lost his job, he couldn't get open, couldn't figure out where to get reliable information. People on the right spoke to him, and by the end of the year, he had cut me off and decided to protest everything. Live free or die. And I tell his story really sympathetically because I want everybody to understand why 2020 was so alienating for so many people who felt like the government didn't have their back, and they got moved on the right. But I'm not going to go there now because I want to take us to a different place before we go celebrate. Because we got through it. We should celebrate a little bit. Nuala O'Doherty, she, only person in her nuclear family born in the United States, a family of Irish immigrants. Went to high school in New York, went to St. John's Law School in Queens, moved to Astoria. Anyone know Astoria here? Anyone know Queens a little bit? Okay, very diverse neighborhood. Worked for 29 years as a prosecutor for Manhattan. Busted Hispanic drug gangs. That was her thing. She calls herself 5 feet tall in heels. Do not get on the wrong side of Nuala O'Doherty. Falls in love with an Ecuadorian guy at a bodega in Astoria. He's an auto mechanic. They get married, they have kids, they move to a neighborhood called Jackson Heights. Raise your hand if you've been to Jackson Heights. Okay, you all got to get on a bus and get yourselves to Jackson Heights. It might be the most interesting neighborhood in America. They speak something like 165 languages in Jackson Heights, and it is a culinary delight. It's an amazing place. It's poor, immigrant, incredibly dense, incredibly crowded, so interesting, and completely vulnerable to a disease like COVID because of the crowding and because there's so many people who are in this cash economy. And Nuala has just retired as a district attorney, and she is running for office, for like a small local office. Beginning of 2020, and she realizes we're in big trouble here. My neighbors are in big trouble. She's got a little campaign headquarters, and she has her kids make these posters. She writes on a Post-it note, "If you need help, call me." And she Xeroxes it. That means copy. They copy it, and they put it on posters all over the place. And the next day, she's got scores of phone calls, text messages, so many people asking for help. I don't know what you're enjoying so much here, but you like that resonated with you, the Xerox thing, yeah, okay. So she's got so many messages, she doesn't know what to. So many people in Jackson Heights need help, right? And it makes sense, right? They've just lost their job in the cash economy. They have no idea how they're going to protect themselves. Nuala comes up with another idea. She writes on the next day, she does another Post-it note, another poster, and the next poster says, "If you can give help, call me." By the end of that day, she's got even more calls. Nuala and her husband own a house. They turned the basement of their house into the Relief Operations Center for what they call the COVID Cares Neighborhood Network. And that is an example of one of the amazing things that we did in the United States in every neighborhood, Team Red and Team Blue, urban and suburban, and those are called mutual aid networks. Mutual aid networks. And within a few days, they had set up this operation in Nuala's basement. They got food bags, they've got cleaning supplies, they're getting medications. They had volunteers who were willing, despite the risk, to go and provide service for people who needed care with the kids, care with an older person. My spouse is in the hospital. They started fanning out and doing stuff together. Within a few months, there were thousands of people involved in this activity, COVID Care Neighborhood Network, and they started to branch out as the first surge died down. They would move to other things. They started to fight to get a street converted into a park, to an open street park, because they didn't have a lot of green space in the neighborhood. They started to work to help people get signed up for vaccines. They just took on all these projects. And what Nuala said to me is, when 2020 started, this was a neighborhood that was anonymous. People kept to themselves. It was a New York City neighborhood. At the end of 2020, it was like living in Mayberry. We all know each other's names. And I don't know how many tens of thousands of meals or medications or vaccines happened because of the work that this mutual aid network did together. But it's a staggering number. And it's an awesome thing, because if a lot of what I've told you about tonight is the story of hyper-individualism and the excesses of a place that's lost its way, there's always been this other side of American life, which is that there is this spirit of volunteerism and local connection and local support, and we are still capable of it. No matter what happened a couple weeks ago, no matter what happened in 2020, we're still capable of that. Nuala's story is totally inspiring, actually. And when my book came out a few months ago, New York Magazine said, we want to excerpt the story of Nuala. It's great, like what everyone needs to read right now. And before we publish it, could you just reach out to Nuala and ask her, what's new? I said, yeah. So I called Nuala. I said, Nuala, what's going on? She said, oh, Eric, I'm so busy right now. I'm so busy. I was like, yeah. She's like, well, I said, what's going on? She said, well, you know I'm married to an Ecuadorian guy, right? And I said, Nuala, there's an entire chapter in my book about you. Yes, like I know you're married to an Ecuadorian guy. And she said, okay, well, have you heard about that whole surge of migrants who've come to New York? And I said, yeah, read about that. She said, oh, well, my husband's cousin's friend has just arrived, and she could use some help with her immigration forms and asylum forms. And you're a lawyer. Would you mind spending some time with her? She says, okay. No, don't know anything about immigration law, but I'll do it. And so they spend a few hours together. She does it. And the young woman says to her when she's finished, thank you so much. Would you mind if I gave your number to a friend? And about a week later, Nuala and her husband wake up. It's 3 a.m. There's a lot of noise outside. They peer out the window, and there's a line of people sleeping on cardboard because they're waiting in line for Nuala to help them with their papers. And Nuala says, so now the basement that used to be the COVID Care Neighborhood Network is the Jackson Heights Immigration Center. And the same people who work together to deal with this disease are here 5 days a week, volunteering, helping the newest migrants to New York get their papers in, get situated, figure out how to live in this country. Let that sink in for a minute. Because if you're like me, and I don't know if you're like me, and I hope you're not, but if you're like me, you're not feeling great about things these days. It's a nervy time, as I've said. There's a lot to feel uncomfortable about. But what Nuala's story always reminds me of is that there is this kind of invisible civic infrastructure in America. And there is this heartbeat of America that's easy for us to lose in our darkest moments, that still beats and is still there. And if we put our ear to the ground and we take each other seriously, we have a lot to learn. All right, thank you very much.
I hope this is working. Great. I can't imagine anyone has any reaction or anything to say after that, but just in case, we have some time for questions. So I'm standing over here so students can't completely avoid me who are in my class, but we'll go sort of section by section. So just raise your hand, and a student, I believe, will bring your microphone. So who has a question over here?
Do you want to get a mic over there? Just wait 1 second. There's a mic coming down.
Thank you. I wrote down my question. So
Nice. Good technique.
I thought it was really interesting how you isolated like certain objects or medicine that showed loyalty to like a certain ideology or team. My question is, do you believe that there are any of these objects or things that we can look at in 2024 that we don't realize even show party affiliation? And if not, does this mean that things are getting better?
Wow. That's your assignment for class tomorrow. What are those objects? I mean, unfortunately, I think a lot of those objects have the same salience. And I was clear, I'm especially concerned about vaccines because of the nomination of RFK Jr. to be the head of HHS. That just feels like needlessly reckless to me because vaccines play such an important role in preserving life and protecting communities. And I am really nervous that this next government's somewhat random choice of this person, because there's all kinds of people who could be Trumpy HHS secretaries, but don't have that view of like the irony is, let's remember, and you could argue with me, his greatest success as president was the vaccine. Like the thing, I don't know, maybe someone wants to disagree with me, maybe it was tax cuts for the rich. But if you ask me, like the greatest success of the presidency was the vaccine. And now the guy he wants to have run HHS is an anti-vaxxer who's already signaling like, oh, we might remove the legal protections on pharmaceutical companies who make vaccines to make it easier for people who have a bad reaction to a vaccine to sue. And we know statistically that some percentage of people who take a vaccine have a negative reaction. So this government could put the pharmaceutical world on ice, and that would come at an enormous cost. So I know that wasn't really your question, but I want to say I think a lot of these symbols and objects have not lost their salience, and I'm sure that there are new ones that emerged from 2024 that have become even more divisive objects. I mean, I think, for instance, not quite an object, it's more a class of people. But in my part of America, where it seemed like no one really cared about the election on TV because it was not super contested, we still got at every single commercial break a commercial about Kamala promising trans rights, and the object of a trans person has become really divisive, and no one really knows what's going to happen. So I worry about that too. So, and I'm sure there are others. Anyway, let's take more questions. Thank you. It's a great question.
Okay. Any questions here?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Let's get the mic over there. Yeah. All right. Are you going to get extra credit for this question, sir?
Yeah, I am. I'm in Thad's class. Yeah. I'm only kidding.
We all should be in Thad's class, yeah.
How did you find and decide on the people that you wrote about in your book?
Thank you for asking that question. I wanted to have a diverse set of people with different political ideologies, with different socioeconomic standing, different racial, ethnic backgrounds, all of it. I wanted to be able to give you a wide portrait. And so the way I did it was not exactly the scientific method, but it worked. I was following the pandemic's path through New York really closely. And I thought, okay, if I were going to describe what happened in Manhattan, here are the big themes from the Manhattan experience. Here are the big themes from the Bronx experience. Here are the big themes from the Queens experience. Now, if you've lived in any of these places, you know this is a ridiculous exercise because there's 1 million people in each of the boroughs. So there's something silly about it. At the same time, we could probably agree, Staten Island, it's the most conservative and white borough in New York. There were the most protests against the lockdowns. It made sense to make the Staten Island character somebody who was on the, who wound up getting kind of more and more radicalized on the right. Queens is this amazing kind of melting pot, super diverse borough. It made sense to think about the way the mutual aid networks really moved up there. So I had this set of themes for each borough. And then I was doing some large-scale sociological research projects with a team of people. I had postdocs and graduate students. So we were all doing interviews on specific questions. And in the process of doing interviews, we're getting to know hundreds of people. And what was amazing about the pandemic is that everybody was home with lots of time on their hands, and they were unbelievably eager to talk to us about all kinds of intimate things. I'm telling you, it's never been so easy to do sociology in my life. It was like drinking from a fire hose every day. It was fantastic. And not only did people want to talk, and not only were they available, but a lot of people wanted to bare their souls, right? They really wanted to talk about the things that they were experiencing, and we were getting very intimate data to put people's experiences in that crude language. And so as I thought about the themes, I then started to match people from the interview list with the themes, and then I recruited the Danny Prestes. I actually saw him on a media story, and I was like, that's my guy right there. But then I would reach out to them and say, hey, listen, I'm really interested in your story. Could we talk again? And in every single case that people wanted to talk more and more and more, and with one exception, which is that I tell the story in the book, that at some point Danny Presti friended me on Facebook, the guy from Staten Island. He's the only person I interviewed of hundreds who reached out to me in social media, I want to friend you and get to know you better. And I thought, this is amazing, it's really working, this, let's understand each other, which is obviously the goal of this book. And, but then when he friended me, he discovered that our political worldviews didn't align very nicely at all, and probably didn't trust that I was going to treat his story with empathy, which I really do. I've had many friends get mad at me for telling his story too sympathetically. And then he cut me off. So that's the story. Yeah.
Okay. Right here.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to add, you told the story of, what is her name again?
Nuala Doherty.
Nuala.
Nuala O'Doherty.
And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see, how does a society move towards solidarity or towards polarization, and what do you see on the ground, or what's possible that could help move things towards solidarity?
Well, listen, I think it's The short answer is doing stuff together. And the long answer is actually in the book I wrote before I wrote the book 2020. It's called Palaces for the People, and it's a book about what I call social infrastructure, and it makes the case that one of the problems with our society is that we've failed to invest in each other with gathering spaces that are open and accessible and democratic, and where we can do things that don't involve yelling at each other. So, like, are we producing the best library? Like, do we have access to the best libraries that are great places to be? What are our parks and playgrounds look like? You know, what about our athletic fields? How inclusive are our public spaces? And the book is a kind of case that one of the things that's happened over the last several decades is that we have kind of neglected this inheritance of all of these great public spaces that we got from the generations before us. Because, right, like in the Old Testament, it doesn't say like on the fourth day, God shall deliver the library. Like we had to make those. Like we built libraries, we built public parks, we built playgrounds, we built public schools, we built athletic fields, right? We created those things, and we've kind of taken them for granted. And so what's happened is, like, if you have wealth, you now go to a country club, you have a private swimming pool, you live in an exclusive suburb where you have a beautiful field, but it's for kids in your suburb only, right? And we failed to build the widely shared, more democratic public spaces that, dare I say, made America great before. And so my kind of recipe for what we need to do is to start investing in each other more seriously. And the idea is social infrastructure. So if you buy the Palaces for the People book instead of the 2020 book, I'll give you a pass. Mariana, she's got a deal. Buy two. Thank you. Is that
All right. Any more questions? Okay.
Let's do a couple in a row.
Okay.
So that people can get at all the good food that's out there. Yeah. So you got a student question here.
Student question here.
Let's privilege some students here.
Okay.
You're a student? Can I see some ID? I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. No, okay, we got a student right here.
Yeah.
Let's take a few student questions. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So sort of following the same track as that last question, do you feel like the lack of investment in like kind of the public institutions or third spaces, if you will, do you believe that that is more because of a moral failing in the public, or do you think that that is more a response to ineffective lawmakers and leaders?
Great. Let's do a couple more questions. Yeah, go right behind you.
This is more geared toward your second to last question.
Okay.
How do you think social media has affected polarization throughout the past 4 years,
Great.
especially with the lack of face-to-face contact?
Good question. Yeah. Can we go on the other side of the room here? Yeah. You're getting it because the gentleman next to you has been so aggressive at trying to get you the microphone. Yeah, in the green shirt. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I was wondering how you talked about how often crises bring our social norms into question. I was wondering if today, with all of this partisanism in our society, if you believe that democracy in the United States could survive another crisis.
Wow. Let's debate that at the cocktail hour. On social media, I mean, there's a chapter in the book that looks really closely at the experiences of on social media of 4 different groups: 2 very conservative kind of Facebook groups, and then 1 mainstream Democrat Facebook group, and 1 very progressive Facebook group. And what's fascinating, if you just follow the narrative, like chronologically, is that you realize that if you're spending your time primarily in social media land, you're getting a very curated experience, and it's very different from the experience of other people. So one of the startling things about being in America right now is that you often find yourself in a conversation with someone and you realize quickly that they're just dealing with a completely different set of facts, right? The facts that they are dealing with are just not the facts that you're dealing with. And so absolutely, if you are in social media and you want to do like a Facebook group and stay in that, you're going to wind up with a very particular story. That said, the data about the way people use social media are much more interesting than that, because they tell us that typically people on social media are not just in one bubble. That actually people are exposed to a lot of views that challenge their primary view. Now what they do with that, I don't really know, right? We don't really know. But it's my belief that actually we tend to overstate the extent to which our lives are confined by the particular social media community we use. My view of like what happens with you and your friends is probably that you're layering a lot of different kinds of information, and that you have a Facebook group. I know you don't have a Facebook group. You don't even know what Facebook is. You have a TikTok stream that's determined by an algorithm by people in China who want to control America. But you have a stream, and you're in that stream, but then you probably break out of it and have a different kind of stream. So I think we should be mindful of the extent to which certain kinds of social media experiences can really lure us into thinking everyone's going to vote this way. Obviously, Kamala is going to win by a landslide because everybody on my Facebook feed is way into Kamala, right? There's that kind of sloppy thinking. But I do think most people are connected in different ways. Your question is about, is this us or is it our lawmakers? Well, I don't really think it's us in the democratic sense. I don't think it's us. Like if you poll Americans on whether they want to have better parks and better libraries and things like that, like the majority of us want that. But those viewpoints are not represented very well in government, and they're especially like one reason is that there's no limits on how much money you can give, and so influential people tend to be much wealthier, and their interests are not to have the best public libraries. But at the local level, I think, even in quite progressive communities, we have come, I think because we take for granted these public amenities, we have come to see things like the library budget or the parks budget as a luxury. And the notion is like we pay for the core things, by which I mean the police. I'm not a defund the police person, but look at municipal budgets. We pay for a certain set of things. We pay a lot for them, and we don't do, or we cut local taxes. There are a lot of states that have taxes that are so low that it's difficult to get enough revenue for services. And I think we think of these great public amenities that are equalizing and that are democratic as luxuries, and they are not the things that the power elite, the team that runs cities, is clamoring for. And so that book, The Palaces for the People, is really a case that we've screwed this up, that we've actually lost a thread of something that was great about American civic culture, and that it's now our job to rebuild. And like we're not going to rebuild? Twitter, right? We're not going to rebuild civil society on Twitter or TikTok, right, or Snapchat, or whatever it is that I don't even know about. We're going to do it in places like this when we're all together, right? Whether we're on Team Red or Team Blue, it kind of matters less when we're having a conversation and it's interesting, and we just want to talk about stuff. That's how we're going to rebuild. So thank you all very much. It's been a great night.